Torah and Science Part 2, Reconcilable and Irreconcilable Differences. We're going to continue our discussion of the benefits and liabilities of scientific inquiry. And I just want to continue where we left off last week and clarify a few points. I'm going to try and save a few minutes at the end for some questions and answers. It doesn't leave us with a lot of time, so let's get started. Last week we observed that the Rambam, for Maimonides, scientific inquiry is part and parcel of Talmud Torah. It's part and parcel of Torah study, meaning that when a person tries to discover the truths of the world around him, of both the physical and the metaphysical world around himself, he is engaging in a worthy endeavor that is sanctioned by God. And that is why the Rambam includes, as the first 4 chapters of his Mishnah Torah, a discussion of Aristotelian physics and metaphysics, which for the Rambam was the science of his time. He feels that God gave us an intellect, and at some point in the Moreh Nevuchim, in the Guide for the Perplexed, the Rambam also writes that faith that is not based upon what we would call reason, or philosophy, or philosophical inquiry, or scientific inquiry, is not true faith at all. Because if a person does not use their mind and their ability to observe and their ability to discover, if they don't use that faculty that God gave them properly, then they are squandering the most valuable component of their humanity. The thing that makes us uniquely human, the thing that makes us created in the image of God, is our ability to reason, is our ability to process information and to make that information about the reality of the world that God gave us a part of ourselves. And if we therefore just rely on information about God and His universe based upon what people tell us without investigating it for ourselves, then we are not truly engaged in faith. We're engaged in some kind of very superficial form of faith, but it's not true faith. Faith for the Rambam has to be based upon scientific inquiry. Now you may hear this discussed in philosophical circles as the debate between faith and reason, but I believe that it translates equally true to faith based on tradition versus faith based on scientific inquiry. So it's very clear for the Rambam that this science is very much, not only is it of value to study science and to study the world around us, but it is also our holy mandate. It is a commandment from Hashem as part of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, as part of the mitzvah of understanding God's world, to engage in scientific inquiry. Now, as to the question about, well, what happened to it? Why was it consigned? Why do we have to consult Greek philosophy and science in order to be able to understand the world around us? Why couldn't Chazal have presented us with a science textbook that we could have used? Why was it necessary for the Rambam to rely on Aristotle? Why isn't there a separate section of Torah Sheba'al Peh which deals with all of these issues of what the Rambam calls physics and metaphysics? And so that's a question that the Rambam engages in his Moreh Nevuchim, in his Guide for the Perplexed. It's in the first section in chapter 71 of the first part of Moreh Nevuchim. And you have it there in English. And the Rambam says something very interesting. He says that the more esoteric the Torah is, the less that it allows itself to be committed to transmission, and certainly not to writing. And if you take a look, here's what he's trying to explain. He says, know that many branches, and this is source number 1 in the new sheets. The old sheets will have this as a later source, but by the way, it should say part 2 on the top of the sheet. That's a typo. It says part 1. So he says, know that many branches of science relating to the correct solution of these problems were once, he's talking about philosophical issues, were once cultivated by our forefathers, but were in the course of time neglected, especially in consequence of the tyranny which barbarous nations exercised over us. We really used to have a very rich discussion in the Beis Medrash about scientific and philosophical ideas, but the tradition of these conversations was lost over time, especially when a people goes into exile, they lose a lot of their very delicate and esoteric, secret or difficult areas of knowledge. Because it's very difficult to transport these kinds of knowledge from one place to another. He says, and another issue, he says, besides, speculative studies were not open to all people. As we have already stated, only the subjects taught in the scriptures were accessible to all. He says, furthermore, there are certain limitations that different types of people have. Some types of Jews are not capable of very difficult areas of study. And as a result, this is a discipline, the discipline of philosophy and science is a discipline that was really limited to many Jews. And so when you put all of this together, what you have is a Torah Sheba'al Peh. The Rambam writes that many aspects of Torah, our rabbis told us, we don't want you to commit them to writing. Why? Because when you commit certain teachings to writing, there is a greater likelihood that those teachings will become corrupted over the course of a few generations. How so? Because there are going to be errors in transcription. There are going to be errors in the way that a person reads the text. And so there's a value in retaining Torah Sheba'al Peh. And this is not the Rambam himself. This is a very common tradition of why the rabbis wanted to preserve certain aspects of our teachings orally. Because when you communicate things from teacher to student directly, there's a greater assurance of guaranteeing that the message remains intact and does not get distorted over time. So he says, if that's true about certain halachic aspects of Judaism, then imagine how much more that is true when it comes to certain esoteric teachings within Judaism. And so therefore for the Rambam, while the rabbis found it necessary at one time to take a significant portion of Torah Sheba'al Peh, of our oral tradition, and commit it to writing, that's the Mishnah, and then later on they took an even bigger chunk of our oral tradition and committed it to further writing and codification, which is the Gemara, they never decided, or perhaps they actively decided, not to commit the more esoteric teachings of the Torah, i.e. physics and metaphysics, to commit that to writing. Because that was not something that lent itself to be transmitted through a communication that was not from teacher to student. And as a result, what the byproduct of that decision was that many of these scientific ideas of physics and metaphysics were lost to the vast majority of the Jewish people. They were preserved by the select few, but that information did not always trickle down from generation to generation. So note how the Rambam views his role in taking the science of his day and appending it to Torah knowledge. He's basically saying, I am regathering all of the Torah information, the esoteric information of Torah that was lost over the centuries, and just reintroducing it into the stream of Torah knowledge. We had it. The Greeks took a lot of it from us, and much of it they got right and they preserved. And so therefore all I'm doing is taking what the Greeks sort of preserved of scientific knowledge and reintroducing it into the Torah stream. That's what the Rambam views himself as doing. Now, he's not alone in this belief. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi had an extreme belief in this idea. He says, if you take a look in source number 3, which is from the second essay of the Kuzari, on page 2, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi believes, in paragraph 66 of the second essay, he says, perhaps you can say the same about Shlomo's wisdom, that our knowledge today pales by comparison. Blessed with divine inspiration, a masterful intellect, and an inborn disposition, he was able to deal with all areas of knowledge. All the nations of the world, as far as India, came to him to transcribe his wisdom for themselves. Thus, the foundations and fundamentals of all areas of knowledge trace themselves to us. They were passed first to the Chaldeans, then to Persian Media, then to Greece, and then to Rome. With the passage of time and multiple transcriptions, it was forgotten that those areas of wisdom originated with the Jews, and they were instead attributed to the Greeks and Romans. So you notice how Rabbi Yehuda Halevi understands what's going on. Where did the Greeks get all of their knowledge of science and of the world around them and of physics and metaphysics? They got it from Solomon. The problem is that, over the course of time, people forget where the original source comes from. Now, I've never been able to, in my studies of the Kuzari, I've never been able to find a source for where Rabbi Yehuda Halevi gets this from. And I don't know necessarily that he has one. But his Judeo-centricity compels him to conclude that if there is knowledge out there in the world about anything under the sun, it must have originated with Judaism, because after all, there is a primacy to Jewish knowledge in Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's mind. So therefore, if the Greeks know something about science, if the Babylonians know something about mathematics, they must have gotten it from us. Because we're the masters of knowledge. We're the masters of truth. Because we are the ones who are able to understand the world the most, because we have this ability to prophesy and communicate with God directly. That's the attitude that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi has. Now, for him, therefore, for Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, it is when we find truths about the world around us in other cultures and from the outside of the Torah world, therefore, any truths that you do discover are really part of our original tradition that just got lost and they've just been repackaged. What's interesting, however, about Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is that we're going to discover that he was not as much of a fan of scientific inquiry as the Rambam was. But before we get to that, I want to just go back and point out that the Rambam was not alone in his favoring scientific inquiry as being part of a genuine religious endeavor. For the Rambam, it's an intellectual endeavor of Talmud Torah, of Torah study. And for others, it's actually an exercise in a faith inspiration through scientific inquiry. And that's why, and Rabbeinu Bechaya ibn Pakuda in his Chavot HaLevavot looks at scientific inquiry in that fashion. Not so much as an obligation for one to exercise his intellect in order to understand Torah knowledge, but more so as a means of being inspired in his faith to appreciate God and his world. So if we take a look in source number 2, in the duties of the heart, in the Shar HaBechina, in the gate of reflection, these translations are not mine, by the way. I happened to pull them off the web, so I can't take credit for some of these translations. In chapter 1, these are just small extractions of what Rabbeinu Bechaya says. He says, by this examination is meant meditating upon the marks of divine wisdom manifested in all created things. In other words, Rabbeinu Bechaya starts off in the Shar HaBechina, the gate of reflection, saying that it is the human's responsibility to reflect upon the world around him in order to gain a greater understanding and appreciation of his Creator. So what does he mean by reflection or meditation? He says you have to think about all created things and earnestly evaluating these marks to the utmost of one's mental capacity. For wisdom, though varied in its manifestations in created things, is fundamentally and essentially one. Just as the sun is one body, while the appearance of its rays when passing through glasses that are white, dark, red, or green varies and assumes respectively the color of each medium, and just as water with which a park is sprinkled assumes the color of the bloom on which it falls. You may see a multitude of different kinds of scientific knowledge, or you may see a multitude of things that exist in nature, but they all coalesce into one divine source. He says, because just like a prism breaks apart different colors, so too the world is multitudinous, but it really goes all back to its one source of wisdom. Contemplate, therefore, God's creatures, from the largest of them to the smallest, and reflect on those matters which are at present hidden from you. And with the help of the Almighty, you will find that they are as I have told you. And because these marks of divine wisdom vary in created things, it is our duty to study them and meditate on them till the whole matter becomes established in our souls and abides in our consciousness. And in chapter 2, he reflects upon specifically the obligation to reflect upon nature and the physical world. And so he writes in chapter 2, to the question whether it is our duty to study created things, that's the nature, right, or not. We reply that the obligation of doing so and deducing thence proof of the wisdom of the Creator can be established by reasoning from the scriptures and from traditional lore. And he says, logically, it makes sense that we should be obligated to study nature. For our reason bears witness that a rational creature's superiority over an irrational one consists in the form of superior ability to perceive, understand, and acquire knowledge of the mysteries of the supernal wisdom, mysteries the existence of which is confirmed throughout the universe. And so then he goes on, he says, and when a man thinks of and reflects upon these foundations of wisdom and studies its vestiges in the universe, his superiority over the dumb brute rises in proportion to his intelligence. It is necessary, because God gave me a brain, gave me an intellect, I'm obligated to use it. And if I don't use it, I'm lower than an animal, because an animal doesn't have a brain. An animal uses what God gave it. If I don't use my mind to understand God, to look, to inquire, and to see the majesty of the world that God created, then I'm squandering the greatest gift of my humanity, the greatest gift that God has given to me. So that too is reflected by Rabbeinu B'chaim. So now let's look at the other side. We've talked about the virtues of scientific inquiry and why it's important to study science as a way of supplementing and augmenting my belief in Hashem and studying His Torah. Let me just throw out a couple of disadvantages that may exist in the study of science. Number one, if we read the Rambam's understanding of physics and metaphysics from his Mishneh Torah, like we did last week, and if we further read about what he writes about Aristotelian science, as he talks about it in the Moreh Nevuchim, in the 22nd essay of the second part, where he says, I want you to know something. He says, everything that Aristotle wrote about the physical realm below the moon, that's the way he talks about it, in a sublunar realm, everything that Aristotle wrote is undoubtedly correct. The only areas where we would question and challenge Aristotle is his understanding of the metaphysical realm, or the realm that is above the moon or beyond the moon. So we won't go into the Rambam's conception of, a geocentric universe for right now, but at the same time, we look at the Rambam and see, he talks about the four elements. He talks about concentric spheres surrounding our planet. And we look at all of this, and based upon our knowledge that we've gained over the centuries, we look at this with great concern. The great Maimonides got it all wrong, because he invested in Aristotelian science when Aristotelian science has all been debunked. So we look at the Rambam today, and if anything, his emphasis on scientific inquiry has compromised his genius. It has made him less important in our eyes instead of more important, because by looking at him with the experience and the knowledge of centuries after him, we realize that most of his science was not science at all, but rather was debunked science. So we look at the Rambam and say, ha ha ha, you got it all wrong, you genius Maimonides, so look how science helped you. So the first question that we have to ask is, so what happens to a person's belief once his science has been debunked, if that indeed is true? In other words, if I try to enhance my knowledge of God and His universe through scientific inquiry, and I come up with and we'll do this next week, God willing, where we talk about the story of creation through a lens of the Torah and how it coincides with the Big Bang. Let's say someone will come along and tell me that the Big Bang was just the Big Bang. It's a bunch of baloney, right? And now all of a sudden, all of the constructs that I've built in my mind to appreciate Hashem and the universe that He's made, is it like a house of cards that comes toppling down? Has my belief now been compromised because of my investiture in bad science? So that's the first downside, potentially, of using science as a way of strengthening and bolstering my pursuit of religion and my pursuit of my understanding of Torah and God. The next problem that we have to think about is, what do we do if we invest so much in science, what do we do with those scientific beliefs that directly contradict the Torah, the Torah's statements? This was a huge challenge to both Christians and Jews with the Copernican the Copernican revolution, when it was discovered that we live in a heliocentric universe instead of a geocentric universe. Why was Galileo put into prison? Because according to his new scientific discovery, the Earth was no longer the center of the universe. And of course, we know from the book of Joshua, where it talks about the sun going around the Earth and then being caused to stand still. And we know from many other sources in Scripture that the sun goes around the Earth. So is Scripture now false because science has proven to us that the Earth goes around the sun and not the other way around? So what happens when we discover things from a scientific point of view that seem to directly contradict the Torah? Of course, the modern issue is the theory of evolution. And what do we do? And how do we reconcile our faith with science? So this might also be a reason why it is better to put science to the side and not to even get started, because we're invariably going to hit certain areas which are irreconcilable. You see, the Rambam was not concerned about that, and he basically said, look, there were certain parts of wisdom that Aristotle got right, and certain parts which are irreconcilable with the Torah, which we simply have to reject because the Torah has primacy. So for him it wasn't a challenge, but for others it may be a challenge. Another issue is that scientific knowledge can be limiting. And we're going to see the Vilna Gaon discuss this as his major criticism against the Rambam and his emphasis on physics and metaphysics. And certainly when we talk about empirical science, the modern scientific method of today, where if it's not replicated in the laboratory, then it doesn't exist, that certainly presents a challenge to our faith, because faith by definition is the belief in things that cannot be demonstrated, certainly not demonstrated empirically. And so what do we do with a whole system that is predicated upon the need to prove, the need to demonstrate, and how do you reconcile that? Because many times there's a philosophy of science, you understand what I'm saying? There's a philosophy of science that comes to be at odds with the philosophy of Torah. If the philosophy of science is that in order for it to be true, in order for it to be real, you need to be able to demonstrate it, that runs completely counter to Torah inquiry or faith inquiry, which is based upon the belief that things can exist and must exist, even though they are not provable, even though they are not demonstrable in the laboratory. And finally, let's talk about the primacy of intellect, like we talked about last week. The word philosophy that we mentioned last week, which is the precursor to modern science, philosophia, the love of knowledge. This primacy that is placed on intellect, this primacy that is placed upon the human mind's ability to reason and to process information, is that consistent with the Torah? What about piety? What about the individual who is not a great intellectual mind? Is such a person as important to God and to the Jewish people as a person who exercises their intellect to a greater ability, to a greater extent? So that also should be bothersome to a man or woman of science. And that is, well, in religion, is primacy placed upon one's intellectual proficiency, or is the emphasis placed on one's pietistic proficiency, the ability for one to be righteous, the ability for one to do mitzvahs and to do chesed and to pray? What is the role of all of those things? Is that as important? And this is a big issue, but it's perhaps a little bit more tangential to our discussion of Torah and science. I want to leave several minutes for Q&A, so I want to point out just a couple of more points. The time flies and we don't have much of it. The Vilna Gaon was very critical of the Rambam in a specific area of halakha. The Shulchan Aruch quotes the Rambam directly, and it states, Mishin ashcho akrav mutar lilcho shalav. If a person has been bitten by a scorpion, it is permitted to recite an incantation over the scorpion bite, or over the scorpion itself, it's not clear, va'afilu b'Shabbos. And that can be done even on Shabbos when a person is supposed to minimize his conversation. Nevertheless, even on Shabbos you can pronounce incantations over scorpion bites in order to help them cure you. And then the Shulchan Aruch writes, and this is not in your sheets, he says, Va'afal pi she'ein hadavar mo'il klum. He says, even though incantations are of absolutely no benefit whatsoever, you will not be cured of your scorpion bite by merely uttering incantations over your scorpion bite. Nevertheless, hol u'mesuken hu hitiru. But the rabbis nevertheless permitted us to do this, kidei shelo titaref da'ato alav, so that a person does not become emotionally distraught. The rabbis felt that if a person would become emotionally distraught, it could compromise his physical constitution. And so therefore they said, if you feel it'll help, take the placebo, go right ahead. It's no problem. And you can do so, and there's no problem of doing some kind of illicit incantational exercise which may be akin to magic. No, that's not the exercise of magic that the Torah prohibits. You can go ahead and recite an incantation, even though it's gornished helfen. It's a placebo. It does absolutely nothing. So comes along the Vilna Gaon on this section of Shulchan Aruch, which is a citation of the Rambam. And this is in source number 5. And he says that this halach in Shulchan Aruch finds its source in the Rambam, in the laws of idolatry. And he says, Aval, in the first line he says, Aval kol haba'im acharav chalku alav. He says, all those who come after Maimonides differ with him. Shaharei harbe lechushim ne'emru b'gemaravu. There are many incantations that the Talmud says are efficacious, that work, that are good. V'hu nimshach achar ha'filosophia ha'arura. The Rambam was drawn after that cursed philosophy. V'lachein kasav shekeshafim v'shemos u'lechashim v'shedim u'kameos hakol hu sheker. And that's why Maimonides writes that magic and incantations and using divine names and demons and talismans, all of these things are false. Aval kvar hiku osan al kod kado. But they have already taken all of these things and used them to hit the Rambam over his head. It's just a phrase. Sharei matzinu harbe ma'asios b'gemara al pi shemos u'keshafim. Because after all, we find many stories in the Gemara where the rabbis use holy names and incantations and ward off demons and use magical formulations and are able to do things that are involved with magic, the supernatural, all the things that the Rambam says don't exist. Now, he says, amulets and incantations, there's more than I can even itemize. But what caused Maimonides to go astray? He says, V'hafilosophia hitaso. He says, Berov lekacha. The great allure of philosophy drew Maimonides away from the supernatural realm. Because when you steep yourself into the study of science, then you tend to forget that other things may exist beyond that which is part of the empirical or demonstrable world, or a reason-based world. Lefaresh hagemara hakol b'derech halat sihi v'la'akorasan mipashtan. And this is what caused Maimonides to say that any time the Talmud talks about demons and incantations and magic, it's all meant metaphorically and not to be taken literally. V'chas v'shalom, says the Vilna Gaon, the great Eliyahu of Vilna. He says, God forbid that to be true. Eini ma'amin bahem v'lo mehem v'lo me'amonam. I don't believe in any of this stuff. Ela kol hadvarim hem kipshatan. He says, but all of these things should rather be understood in their simple understanding. Ela sheyesh behem penimios. But they have an inner meaning, a deeper mystical meaning. Lo penimios shel ba'alei hafilosifa. Not like the inner meaning, the esoteric explanations of the philosophers, shizorkin oso la'ashpa, which we should throw in the garbage, literally is what he says. Shehem chitzonios, because that's really all superficial compared to the deeper depths of mystical wisdom. Elashel ba'alei ha'emes, but rather if you study Kabbalah, and you study the deeper truths of reality that are not based on philosophical or scientific inquiry, only then do you come to the deeper truths. So you see very clearly that the Rambam was deeply criticized. You don't have to come to the 18th century to get to that criticism. There are many portions of the Rambam's books that were banned. The study of Greek philosophy was banned shortly after the Rambam's death because of the Rambam's investiture in this discipline. And so you see that there is this great divide that exists with us even to this day. Those who are Maimonidean in their approach and who feel that there is virtue and that it is actually part of our holy obligation to study science in order to be able to understand HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the world that He gave us. And the more that we understand of the world around us, of nature and of science, the greater a knowledge we will have of God, and thereby fulfilling our holy purpose in life. There are others, including Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who feels that this is counterproductive, that even though there may be areas of science and philosophy that do reflect upon the truths of God and His universe, but a person can become entrenched and trapped within a system that will pull him away from his faith. So that really is a synopsis or a review of basically the two sides of the coin. And therefore, we cannot fault someone who says, I don't want to expose my child to dinosaurs because I'm worried that they may become part of an entire worldview that will pull them away from Torah. But the problem becomes, and this is more of a social commentary, the problem becomes that in a world of today, it becomes virtually impossible to exercise that option unless you really completely sequester yourself, your family, and your community from the outside world. Anything short of that will result in a lot of confusion and ultimately disaster theologically for your children, because trying to shield them from scientific knowledge with the knowledge that they will eventually be exposed to it in some venue other than in the safety and security of your home and your Jewish school means that you're setting them up for theological failure. So it's very important to keep this in mind. If a school believes in our children seeking higher education, if it believes in the value of secular education, then we need to educate our children even about those areas of science that may present somewhat challenges on a superficial level, but nevertheless they have to be addressed. We can't sweep things under the rug. Let me leave some time for some questions and answers, because we only have